This panel is the 5G auction and beyond. Quick housekeeping point. Some of the parties represented here are potential bidders in the FCC's 37, 39, and 47 gigahertz band auction starting December 10th. So they're subject to anti-collusion restrictions and can't talk about that auction or matters that affect it. And so I'll just go with a quick introduction and we'll start. First, we have Brian Hendricks. Brian is Vice President of Policy and Public Affairs for Nokia in North America, as well as Central and South America. Next, we have Grant Spellmeyer. Grant is Vice President of Federal Affairs and Public Policy for U.S. Cellular, where he's responsible for the company's regulatory and policy efforts. Next, we have Louis Peretz, is that correct?
Louis Peretz.
Louis Peretz. Louis is WISPA's Vice President of Policy, and in that capacity, he works to advance a successful track record before the FCC, NTIA, and other federal agencies. Then we have Patrick Welsh. Patrick is Verizon's Assistant Vice President, Wireless Policy Development, and is engaged in development of Verizon's public policy positions on spectrum and other wireless issues. And finally, we have Steve Sharkey. Steve is Vice President, Government Affairs, Technology, and Engineering Policy in T-Mobile's Government Affairs Office, where he has responsibility for T-Mobile's technical policy agenda and manages a team of technical experts to achieve the company's policy goals. Thank you so much for joining us today. Let's just kick things off here. Private versus public 5G auction. What are the strongest arguments for your preferred? Oh no, wait, sorry. Are we doing opening statements?
I think we just.
Okay, sorry.
All
right. So if everyone's prepared to opening statement, why don't we just go ahead with those really quickly? If we can keep them as close to 3 minutes as possible, that'd be great.
This on? So thank you first for the opportunity to come and present here. What I'll talk a little bit about, I think, is from the standpoint of a global supplier, we have some visibility into where the United States is at relative to the rest of the world and its preparedness for 5G. And we think that is a highly relevant question for the Commission to be looking at here as it thinks about allocation of mid-band spectrum, which is at this point a deeply conspicuous missing ingredient to the U.S. 5G success. And at the top, I think Ansel Adams, the great photographer, used to say there's nothing worse than a fuzzy or a sharp image of a fuzzy concept. And we've reached a point in this proceeding where we are talking in abstractions now that are not informed by a lot of facts. One of those being where the U.S. is relative to the rest of the world, which feeds the exigency argument and the need for speed here and what that ultimately means. Not to the exclusion of all other considerations, but it's an incredibly important part of the conversation as the FCC looks at this. Secondly, I think charitably, we've reached a point in this proceeding which is the rarest of all outcomes in Washington, and I don't mean bipartisanship, I mean that we have a proceeding where both everything that needs to be said has been said, and it has been said by everybody who wants to say it. It is time to drop the curtain and make a decision here. Now, our advocacy has been pretty clear that there are values to moving quickly. One of which is that when you look particularly at Asia, which has not only allocated mid-band spectrum, but has huge population centers which will begin receiving service on networks built primarily in mid-band spectrum within the next 12 to 15 months, that places the U.S. innovation ecosystem at tremendous risk, puts tremendous pressure on us to get that spectrum into the marketplace quickly so that it can get built out. Again, not to the exclusion of every other consideration, but it bears mention that when you have several billion people who are going to be wired with mid-band spectrum in the Asian region, and not just Asia, but in other places as well, we're long past time for the U.S. to act on mid-band. Secondly, we've heard people talk about the question of speed of a traditional auction versus a private sale. Two things that don't get talked about are beyond when you can actually calendar something to happen, the clearing timelines, the incentives that parties have to do the things that are necessary to prepare the way for that spectrum to be clear, and what ultimately will happen in the equipment ecosystem. As a general rule, we don't do radio development deals until we have a pretty good idea who is going to have title to the spectrum. And so one of the values of a private sale is that in relatively short order, regardless of what parameters the commission puts around transparency and the process, we're going to know which providers ultimately have spectrum, and we can enter into radio development agreements for that equipment, which means that after you go through a clearing of some period of time, we're actually putting equipment in place and starting to deliver services. If we're going to do a public auction and the outcome of that auction won't be known for several years, the equipment ecosystem will pause, at least for some period of time, and the equipment may or may not be ready, even if the auction itself and the allocation itself is reasonably similar. But we also think that you have to take a look at, especially now that what C-band Alliance has proposed is a multi-technology approach that will involve not only Earth station filters and satellite launches, but potentially video compression as well. That will take time and that will take money. The value in the private sale is in terms of risk-taking, knowing upfront that you will be compensated adequately for those risks. You can undertake the expense of buying satellites and Earth filters and other things. If you have a public auction, there's a real risk that making those decisions will wait until more is known about the auction, until the auction perhaps reaches a certain threshold level where their compensation is guaranteed. And that also has a delay on the only thing that really matters here, not timing of a process, but when can we actually start deploying services. So for those reasons, we have pointed to the private sale of whatever structure as having tremendous value. But we've also spent the last year plus briefing and doing more and more filings. And if we're going to ultimately do a public sale, it is incredibly important that the commission adopt that decision quickly and affirmatively signal that it is going to be prioritized over other things. So we don't just simply have one more auction proceeding slipping to the end of the pipeline of other things, which are, include universal service support auctions and, at least 2, possibly more millimeter wave auctions, the PAL auctions, the 2.5 overlay auction, and et cetera, et cetera. The pipeline is full. The auction software and system are extremely antiquated, unable to do multiple auctions simultaneously. So there's a real risk this slips to the back of the pack. And with respect to what Michael said in the panel before this, the idea that we would do an auction in 2020 is silly. There's just no indication that the commission could do that without an affirmative decision to prioritize it over any other auction. If they were willing to do that, then the idea of a public sale becomes far more viable. Happy to answer other questions, but I think it is important to keep in mind that what happens here in this proceeding has an impact on America's global competitiveness. We are reaching the point almost of negligence in terms of not having mid-band spectrum available in this market. So it is decision time.
Thank you. Grant?
Thank you. So a year ago in Los Angeles, I was on a panel where I described this as the most complex issue that I'd seen in my more than a decade in Washington. A year later, I don't see anything to change that other than, if anything, it's gotten a little more complicated, and we lost another year in the race to 5G that Brian talked about. So let me give you a little bit of a non-national carrier perspective. U.S. Cellular is very interested in participating in a C-band auction. We were the second largest bidder in the 28 gigahertz auction. We were the third largest bidder in the 24 gigahertz auction. We want to come and buy C-band. Our advocacy at the commission is focused on the fact that there needs to be an opportunity for somebody other than the 3 large national carriers to get a piece of this spectrum. So that leads me to focus on things like clearing targets. 200 megahertz is not enough, nor is it acceptable that we sell 200 now and sell some more a few years from now. That just doesn't work for a competitive ecosystem. So it's got to be 300 megahertz. I would have asked Commissioner O'Reilly today if that, when he said 300, he included a guard band or didn't include a guard band in that. I think that's a crucial piece of information. 300 cleared and auctioned megahertz gives you at least 3 100 megahertz licenses. Anything short of that, I think, is a failure. We've been very critical of the C-band Alliance's private sale proposal. In particular, they named it fuel auction proposal to set up a single round sealed bid, as I think Commissioner O'Reilly referred to earlier. It hasn't met with a lot of support. We're certainly opposed to it. We don't like a sealed bid. We don't like a single round. We don't like combinatorial bidding. Combinatorial bidding and package bidding places national carriers in a much stronger position vis-a-vis non-national carriers, and that's got to come out. I don't see why we can't accelerate things. And Brian alluded to the hypothetical possibility that it could be done. I think the FCC should buckle down and prioritize this auction, and if that means pushing other ones back, they need to do that. They've obviously got a lot of work to do, and we'll talk about that on the panel, but we'd like to see a straightforward ascending clock auction that looks very much like what we did in 24 gigahertz. We didn't need combinatorial bidding. We just let's let everybody bid and see how high the prices go, and hopefully that benefits the Treasury and the sellers. And the last thing I would add in closing is that regardless of how this happens, there's got to be a set of guardrails put in place. And again, Commissioner O'Reilly referred to some of them, so that this looks very much like a traditional FCC auction. You've got to have anti-collusion rules. You've got to have ownership disclosure rules. You've got to have rules against inappropriate bidding strategies by shield bidders. There's a lot of guardrails that we've got to put in place fast, and we'd love to be part of the auction process.
Thank you. Louis?
Thanks. Thank you, Teddy. Thank you, David, and the rest of the crew at Capitol Forum for inviting me to be here. When it comes to C-band, the headlines have been focused on 2 public interest goals. First, how much spectrum can be repurposed for 5G commercial advanced wireless mobile services? And second, how much spectrum is necessary, or is there going to be sufficient spectrum reserved for the fixed satellite services Earth stations that are vital to delivering video content programming delivery? What WISPA wants believes there's also another opportunity to advance a third important public interest goal, and that is bridging digital divides. In the 2018 C-band NPRM, on the second page of the NPRM, there's a title that says 5G services and bridging the digital divides. There aren't a whole lot of people. I believe that the only other party besides WISPA that has been focused on rural has been ACA Charter and the ACA Connects proposal. We commend them, but we believe that our sharing proposal is a lot better. What WISPA has proposed is that the FCC should amend its Part 101 rules to permit fixed point to multi-point sharing with C-band Earth stations in the upper portion of the 3.7 to 4.2 gigahertz band. But before I get into the details of our advocacy and the reason why we're pushing this proposal, I want to talk a little bit about WISP and introduce them to the audience today. So there are 2,000 WISPs throughout America, serving 4 million customers. Of those 2,000, 557 are members of the WISPA, my association. And of those 557, 70% serve customers, have a customer base that is 2,000 or fewer. And of those 70%, 70% of the 557 operators who are members of WISPA have 10 or fewer employees. So these are truly small companies. They do not have the capital of the large billion-dollar companies, some of whom are represented on this panel today. And so they rely on unlicensed and licenses in the 3.65 to 3.7 gigahertz band in order to deploy services and fixed wireless services that are 1/7 the cost to deploy fiber and 1/4 the cost to deploy cable in rural areas. And Commissioner Pai in July of 2019 recognized that WISPs are the foot soldiers in the digital revolution. And I think that's an apt term to describe us, because we are truly like serving consumers in communities that are low income, that are rural, and in rural, sparsely populated areas. Now, back to our proposal. So in June of 2017, before there was a mid-band NOI, and before there was a whole lot of talk about repurposing 3.7 to 4.2 for 5G services, we proposed our sharing, as part of a broadband access coalition, introduced our sharing proposal in the C-band. We believe that this, people have been talking about in both panels the need for speed. This is the fastest proposal in terms of delivery service that I've heard about on this panel and that I've read in the docket. Because all the FCC needs to do is it needs to change the rules at Part 101 to change it from fixed service to fixed point to multi-point services, and with a few tweaks that would allow for higher power in the band for fixed services. Sorry, transition to fixed point to multi-point services. This could happen in a matter of months. We don't have to wait for clearing, okay? And it does not get in the way of clearing the spectrum band. I've heard a lot about that on the panel, and I hope we can get into it in some of our discussion today. And it's also a very it's also very straightforward and a simple and quick solution, because this coordinated sharing has already been going on for decades in the 3.65 to 3.7 gigahertz band. And as was pointed out both in the NPRM and in our comments, there's already, the spectrum band 3.7 to 4.2 is already allocated on a primary basis for fixed services and for fixed satellite services. So that sharing is already going on right now. There's nothing technically complex about our proposal, despite what you've heard on prior panels. And also, because there are no federal allocations in this band, we would employ the same coordination mechanism that we're already using between fixed services and fixed satellite services, earth stations, to permit them to share. We would use the same coordination mechanism, but then use a simple automated frequency coordination device going forward. And this does not have to be as complicated as a SAS that we use for CBRS. So in short, we applaud the efforts to repurpose as much as possible for 5G commercial services, but the best way to bridge digital divides is to support our sharing proposal in the C-band.
Thank you. Next, we have Patrick Welsh.
Thanks, Teddy. Verizon supports a private auction over a public auction for the simple reason that it'll happen much, much faster. We think it's unquestionable that a secondary market transaction can put as much spectrum as possible to use faster than a FCC-led auction. And the stakes here are huge. Unless we get more mid-band spectrum available here in the United States, we will fall behind in the race to 5G. And that has huge implications, not just here, but across the globe. The rest of the world has made significant amount of mid-band spectrum available for 5G uses. China, South Korea, Japan, Spain, Italy, the UK, Finland have all made huge swaths of spectrum available in the sweet spot, mid-band spectrum. The US hasn't. We need to move quickly on this, and I agree with many of the comments so far on this panel and previous panels that the FCC is poised to make a decision, and we encourage them to act quickly.
Thank you. Steve?
It was very succinct. This has been good. I guess a few things. I think that what's clear is that we need a significant amount of spectrum in this band. And T-Mobile has put forward a proposal for incentive auctions that we felt could clear up to the full 500 megahertz. Always a stretch goal, always a challenge. I think ACA Connects, Charter, CCA put forward a plan that really works for users and frees up at least 370 megahertz of spectrum. Both of those plans help move towards a future of fiber, and which is the future that content delivery is going to anyway. On the other side of that, you've got the C-Band Alliance, who's put forward a plan that is still at 180 megahertz, which is widely agreed by nearly everybody is insufficient for meeting the competitive needs of the country. I got to say, as I sat and listened to the other panels, I don't know how many people have gone and bought timeshares or you get the pitch on timeshares of, come and it's very high pressure sale. This is the first time I've been to the first, I think, spectrum reallocation where I've seen the incumbent pushing to move so quickly. And if you don't take this deal, you're going to be losing out and missing out on an opportunity. Usually the thing is to walk away and do a different approach. And I think until CBA comes forward with more details about how they're going to make more spectrum available, the contribution that they've talked about, and the process for auctioning that spectrum, that's an acceptable process. It's not a viable opportunity that's been put in front of us. We do have concerns about a private auction. A private auction without significant FCC oversight or structure opens itself up to manipulation. And we've seen even FCC attempts to manipulate FCC auctions, right? I mean, there have been numerous cases of prohibited communications between bidders that the FCC has intervened on. We've seen auctions in the past, like AWS-3, where you had bids manipulated by companies working together. Cases where the financing plans for auctions have really changed the structure of those bids one way or another and led to a bad outcome that tied up spectrum for significant periods of time. The FCC is the best place to have these auctions. And I don't believe that there really is a significant time difference between what an FCC can do to implement an auction versus a private auction that's got the kind of oversight that we really need to keep it, make sure that the integrity of the auction is upheld. So, I do agree with people that it is time to move forward. The record is pretty clear here and pretty full. I do want to comment too, just on the Michael, who I thought did a great job talking about some of the legal issues. The one thing I disagreed on was that the FCC can't hold an incentive auction that sets the price of what the incumbent would get for that spectrum. The incentive auction structure, there's a number of different ways to do it, and the FCC has had a couple now and one upcoming that handles payments differently. So there doesn't necessarily have to be a reverse auction. We proposed an incentive auction that does have a reverse bid, but the FCC could certainly set an amount or a percentage of an auction that could go to the incumbents. And if they're willing to accept that, that's certainly an incentive. So I think there are ways forward, a number of fronts that can move very quickly. And we should do that, make sure that there's sufficient enough spectrum for a competitive environment, including for smaller carriers, and that is a public auction that ensures the integrity of the process. Thank you.
Thank you to everyone. One thing I'd like to kick things off with the question. I mean, this seems like a fairly new idea being presented. Maybe I missed something, that you could have a public auction accompanied with a reprioritization or some kind of prioritization of this. So, you know, given that's an option that we're talking that was brought up here, what does everyone think the real delta is between the time where an FCC could hold an auction, a private auction versus public auction, taking into account this prioritization idea, but also taking into account if you think the one way is more vulnerable legally or rigorous or sound legally?
Well, I guess I'll go first because I talked about it. All right. I'm going to predict that the FCC could notice and make their way through auction rules in 9 to 12 months. I think they could maybe do it a little faster than that if they really made it a priority. But let's say it takes 9 to 12 months. Now, let's compare that to a private sale. I guess if the FCC wants to just look at the C-band alliance and say, go do whatever you want to go do, sell it however you want to go sell it. We're not going to worry about build-out requirements or auction rules or deposits or timelines. They could turn that in 3 or 4 months as opposed to 9 or 12 months. But to me, the difference is there's integrity in the bid process that I think is appealing to bidders who have historically bid in FCC auctions. I mean, we're leery about going to some sort of private sale, much more comfortable with 20 years of auction practice. And I think that's true for a lot of other bidders. And I think that should benefit the sellers of the spectrum as well, to know that there's that certainty. If the only person that shows up to buy at this auction is one wireless carrier in a private sale, they may not get what they think they're going to get in terms of auction revenue.
I get that better? Okay. I would respectfully disagree with Grant in a couple principal areas. The first is what I already told you about what really counts in terms of time is clearing and equipment availability. The process that you choose will have some impact, some big impact on that. And so I hope we actually take account of that. Secondly, you don't have to believe my opinion on this or anyone else's. I mean, we've actually spoken to the people who have designed auctions at the FCC, including, the incentive auctions, and have pretty good heritage. And they have told us 2 years for the commission staff to design a process, given there are still some unknowns here and issues of first impression, including the fact that you have full spectrum issues, you have potential concerns about holdout, you have a whole host of other concerns, including an unknown about how much spectrum will actually be surrendered. They believe it could take as much as 2 years to design an auction, even if the commission says priority. So I think the likelihood that the commission will be able to produce an order and say, even though we want priority, we could do it in 9 months, I see no indication of that. There's no support in the historical context for that.
Can I jump in on that though? So, because I totally disagree with that. I mean, the issues that you've raised don't go away with a private auction versus a public auction. The need for telling the satellite for setting a legal structure for moving forward, both for clearing and for how the process is handled is going to exist. ACA doesn't represent all the satellite companies, and in fact, they've lost one of the satellite companies that'll need to be dealt with. C-band Alliance. You're not eliminating the need for FCC regulation here. That's going to take whatever time is going to take, and it's not going to be different between a public and private auction. And you open yourselves up to having to deal with problems after the fact. We're seeing a lot of kind of vague statements by C-band Alliance right now with nothing filed on the public record, whether it's making a voluntary contribution, clearing more spectrum, or how the spectrum is going to be auctioned. They came forward with an auction proposal, the fuel proposal, that has been widely panned. It's a process that we're certainly not comfortable with, and I don't think any carrier has said that they're comfortable with. So, for the FCC to then just turn around and say, you guys go do whatever you want, I don't think that's going to happen, and you're going to end up with taking the same amount of time to get the auction rules and structure in place, and no significant difference between an FCC-run auction and a private auction if it's done correctly.
I just want to say that I respectfully disagree with Steve.
At
Secondary
least he
market.
did it respectfully.
Secondary market transactions are much faster, and I'd point to what Verizon did when we acquired millimeter wave spectrum from Straight Path and XO. We closed on that deal in 2016. 18 months later, we were launching our first our network on that spectrum. So it's much faster. The second thing is the CBA Alliance has a coalition of the willing, and they are uniquely situated not just to auction the spectrum, but to clear it and make it available for mobile 5G use. And that's critical here. It's very important to have the incumbent on board and rowing in the same direction. And we've seen this in other contexts where those interests aren't aligned. Verizon, AT&T, and T-Mobile have worked very closely with DoD and other federal agencies in repurposing federal spectrum. And we know from that experience that when the incumbent isn't on board, it takes far too long. All right. There's a very different question that federal agencies and incumbents who aren't invested in a successful outcome, the question they answer is how long will this take, right? And when you have a motivated incumbent who wants to make this spectrum available, their question is, well, how quickly can we get it done? And so the delta there is measured in several years. And so I think it's unquestionable that a private auction will set in motion a process not only to transfer the licenses to a higher and better use, but actually clear that spectrum so it can be deployed for the benefit of consumers.
I just want to jump in real quick though, but because I think this is exactly the problem. You've mixed a couple of terms there. First, I totally agree we need to have the incumbents on board with clearing, and that they're a big part of that. They're trying to dictate the process right now to the other incumbents in the band, which are the Earth Station licensees or registrants. But you talked about Straight Path and the private transaction. That's exactly the kind of thing we want to avoid here. Straight Path was a private transaction where you made an agreement with a company. There was not an auction around that. What we're talking about here is a private auction, which is very different. And if we want opportunities for multiple companies to have licenses, it's got to be a very different structure than just going out with one company buying from the other. And we do private transactions all the time and are very supportive of that. In this case, we've got satellite companies that are trying to sell something that they don't have rights to. Right? They've got rights to use this spectrum for satellite. They're asking the FCC to give them terrestrial rights for that spectrum and then let them go someplace else and sell it and take all the money themselves with potentially a private contribution. But again, we haven't seen any details around that.
Because the holdout problem seems like a legal one. So you're going to this is going to be sued either way, it seems like. So I want to remove that for a second, just like from a technical standpoint. Like, why is the does the C-band Alliance have a lot of staff, more staff than the FCC? Like, what is it about the C-band Alliance that they're going to be able to do something that effectively is a private auction with a lot of rules associated? What about the C-band Alliance is that they're going to be able to do something within significantly less than 2 years?
I've been to the C-band Alliance offices. I'm pretty sure, I didn't conduct a comprehensive inventory, but I'm pretty sure it's significantly smaller than the FCC's resources. They're going to have to make a series of decisions, and the question for the FCC is whether they want to, how much of that they want to delegate to them.
You know, ultimately, you know, I don't work for the C-band Alliance, but I think there's been a lot of criticism in suggesting that they're not good actors. Even legislation that has been contemplated in Congress envisioned them being a transition facilitator, because there is a recognition that they understand the satellite issues, the limitations of transponders, the path to clearing while still meeting the needs of existing programmers. These are issues that the FCC staff is perfectly capable of knowing, but it's a function of time and how long it takes for them to become expert in some of those issues. So I think the idea of choosing to have the C-band Alliance companies serve in some fashion as a transition facilitator, proposing a sales process, et cetera, I don't think, with the exception perhaps of Steve or some others, is a terribly controversial concept. There's real value to be had from that. The question is, you know, it's not a binary choice between the commission having no role, which seems to have been suggested here, and the commission micro-prescribing every aspect of what a private sale looks like. I think it's quite likely that you will have transition facilitator role and some very specific requirements for transparency and process before the C-band would be allowed to move forward with any kind of private sale. So I don't think it's a binary choice between the FCC just outsourcing everything with no guide rails. But there is a reason, there is a value that the C-band company brings in terms of knowledge.
And you know, I agree that there's value of having them. Again, they should be supportive, and it's important for them to be supportive and to help in a transition. To the extent that that transition is handling the satellite capacity, what the C-band Alliance is doing is trying to foreclose other options for relocating users, so that they keep their business whole while selling off their excess spectrum. You've got a group with ACA Connects that of those end users that say, look, we want a different path, right? We want to build a fiber network that future-proofs our delivery of services and content, and that's a better path for us. And the C-band Alliance proposal would foreclose that, and again, kind of keep everybody locked in basically a status quo while allowing them to sell excess capacity that they have.
Teddy, if I could just address that real quick. I think that the fundamental problem with Steve's vision here are two assumptions. First, he kind of premises this on incentive auction authority, current incentive auction authority for the FCC. And the fact of the matter is the T-Mobile proposal that calls for that isn't legal under current law. The idea that you can have a bidding between the satellite companies and the earth station receivers just doesn't work, because earth station receivers aren't licensees under the FCC rules. So they can't participate in an incentive auction. So that's point number one. Without an incentive auction, without appropriate economic incentives, the satellite operators are not going to give up this spectrum. The second fundamental problem with Steve's and in T-Mobile's proposal is this idea that we can magically redesign and deploy at scale a new video content distribution network in 18 to 36 months. It's never been done before. We know from past experience when we try to redeploy networks or redesign networks, it takes much longer. I mean, look at the Sprint rebanding effort that's still going on. Look at the incentive auction, and while T-Mobile's done fantastic work in accelerating the transition of the 600 megahertz band from TV, broadcast TV to mobile broadband, it's still taking much too long. So I think when you look with clarity at those two assumptions, I think that proposal fails, and really the only alternative, if we want to meet the time requirements, is a private transaction with the necessary guardrails.
I mean, the incentive auction, broadcast incentive auction is a great example, in fact, of how quickly and efficiently an incentive auction can work for clearing. We heard doom and gloom around that incentive auction from the broadcasters, right? This is never going to happen, 5 to 10 years to clear that. You won't see any of this spectrum for years and years. Even at the auction, everybody said, you're not going to be able to deploy anything for 3 years. Well, we started deploying we started deploying services within about 6 weeks from the time we got the licenses from that band. The clearing is on time, happening as forecast, 36-month clearing time frame. Same kind of thing that CBA is saying, right? So the doom and gloom around the timeline is just not reasonable. And moving to fiber is actually quicker than building and deploying new satellites to do capacity, and going out to every earth station and installing filters.
My last question before we open things up to the audience. We danced around this a little bit, Grant and Patrick. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask. I'm interested in this topic. Verizon's incentives here. I get that want to get it quickly, want to get this done quickly, but this kind of loose partnership with this entity that wants to maximize the amount that you pay them seems awkward, right? Now, there has in the past been a lot of work on the foreclosure value of purchasing spectrum. Grant, is that something that you're worried about? Is there, you mentioned, we danced around, there's only gonna be one buyer. I mean, is that something people are really worried about? Patrick, I don't wanna overblow this, but I'm interested in, Grant, your rules, the restrictions, these protocols that you're interested in having so that this ends up being an auction that everyone participates in, and whether or not you're concerned about this foreclosure issue, and Patrick, to the extent that you just want to refute that, that'd be great.
All right, a lot of questions in there. I'll put concerned about motives. Yeah, absolutely. I don't mean to impugn the motives of the C-band Alliance. I think they are. They clearly have an agenda here, and that agenda is to maximize the sale of spectrum and preserve their business that they're in today. I would like to see, and I'm not talking about some wild, inventive set of guardrails around an auction. I'm going to go back to 24 gigahertz, the last auction the FCC just finished. Let's use those rules. It's as simple as that. Otherwise, I'm concerned that this does devolve into something where one or two national carriers carry off all the spectrum, and there's going to be a dramatic impact on anybody else who's trying to compete in the marketplace below those two.
I'll just say that the economic literature doesn't support this argument that there's a foreclosure value of an incumbent buying spectrum to keep it out of the hands of competitors. The literature just doesn't support that. Secondly, Verizon's motives are pretty clear. We want to get access to as much spectrum as possible to provide the best possible quality of service to our customers. We hope that every interested bidder would participate in the private auction. We want it to be fair, open, and transparent, but it has to be done quickly.
And I think the best way to guard against foreclosure is to let Patrick and I bid against each other in a marketplace, and let's see who bids the highest. Anything short of that is concerning to us.
So just a quick couple thoughts. We certainly aren't that worried that and again, I mean, we are almost agnostic between a prioritized public sale and a private sale. We have concerns about whether those two things actually are equivalent. But in a world in which there is a private sale, I think it is entirely reasonable to anticipate that the commission will require a sales process that is transparent, perhaps with an opportunity for people to comment on it. It would be extremely unlikely that that will include an opportunity for two carriers to walk away with all of the spectrum. We certainly wouldn't support that outcome, since all three of the carriers on this panel are customers for no other reason. And we have other customers who are interested as well, and we're also interested in diversifying our business by having folks who aren't current license holders have an opportunity to participate. So I think we need to stop talking about these things as if they're binary choices, and that the commission's choice is either only a public sale or an unbridled, unrestrained, unsupervised private sale. I don't think that is a realistic expectation. And so I don't think it's fair to continue to have that conversation.
So you're confident that there will be rules on a private auction that ensure that there will end up being three or more people winning the bid?
I mean, I won't be in the business of prognosticating what the commission will do here. Honestly, if I were in the prognostication business, I would have assumed by now we would have had an order in this proceeding. So I would have been wrong all the way along in the process. But I think the record supports the idea that there will have to be a guarantee of participation by multiple entities given. And by the way, that gets a little bit easier to do if you're talking about more spectrum. I agree with Steve and everyone else that if, there's but so many ways that you can divide 180 usable megahertz of spectrum, it's simply not sufficient to meet the market need, given a minimum of 50 to 60 megahertz per carrier probably being needed to do anything beyond LTE. So if in fact reports are true that 300 and above is now usable, is now what the commission is being told, even if privately. I'd like to see that on the record. Then that divides up much more nicely among multiple participants. So I think it would be almost impossible to contemplate a situation in which some guarantees will not have to be made about participation. What that looks like, whether the commission will ask the sales process to be put forward and commented on before it has a second order saying, now go do it, and bring back the resulting sale agreements so that we can ratify them with some public interest obligations. It could look a lot of different ways. I just think it's disingenuous to sit here and argue that this is really just an unrestrained process where we're going to turn loose private actors to maximize their utility and their profits with no oversight by the commission. That is a totally unfair characterization in our judgment of what's likely to happen.
Teddy, can I just say something about the framework? And I wanted to jump in 2 questions ago, but I didn't get an opportunity. If the commission does issue an order, WISPA's main interest, whether it's going to issue an order for a public auction or a private sale, that the commission make a quick decision on our sharing proposal, to grant our sharing proposal, because all they would need to do again is just amend the rule. There doesn't need to be any change to the table of frequency allocations. Just change the rule that would allow fixed services in the 3.7 to 4.2 to enable point to multi-point services.
Go ahead.
I want to respond to my vendor who called me disingenuous. The only thing I can say is I haven't seen anything in the record from the C-band Alliance on a sales process other than the fuel proposal, which is a single round sealed bid national combinatorial structure. That's not good for US Cellular and a whole lot of other people that don't serve the entire country. So if they want to put something more on the record that lays down those guardrails, I would welcome it.
And candidly, I think they'd be the first ones to tell you, I've been counseling them on that very point and other points for the better part of a year, you know, that if it's not on the record, it didn't happen. So I would agree with you in that respect.
So let me also jump in too, because I think the point on FCC oversight and structure is great, right? I mean, if that's where it's going to go, but then it's disingenuous to say that there's a 2-year difference between an FCC auction process and a private auction process, because that's where the time is to get the structure in place that ensures the integrity of the auction, and there is not any significant time difference between a private auction and a public auction in that case.
We've got some questions here. Let's go, JP.
So how do you square the consensus, it would seem almost, that there have to be changes to the current CBA auction structure, more guardrails, et cetera, and Commissioner O'Reilly's comment a short while ago that he didn't think the auction structure would need to be handled in a second order. How do they get that right by December?
Yeah, the question is how do they get the but how do we get an order by December if there's so much left in terms of uncertainty around the auction design and that we haven't even seen this next iteration of the C-band proposal?
Yeah, I guess we have to see the next iteration of the proposal. And somebody needs to put some guardrails into the record. I had an ex parte 3 weeks ago that enumerated a few of them. So I guess the commission could take those up and adopt them. It's going to be a challenge. The commission's got a lot of work to do between now and the December 12th open meeting.
Wow, we got a lot of questions here. Go ahead, yeah.
In all the back and forth about the timing, there was something that I thought was very frustrating, and I used the word disingenuous to Grant or to Sheldon. The question is, okay, if we're talking about the delta, and I don't have a better basis of saying how long it will take the FCC to finish a proceeding, but I'll go with what Peter said, 2 years. So if we go with that as the FCC process, and then we're comparing what the CBA process would look like. Let's say under the best of conditions, it takes them 6 months to hold an auction after an FCC order, and that would be under the best of conditions. Well, that ain't the end of it. There's a 6 to 9 month process after that where licenses would need to be applied for and issued by the FCC. So at the end of the day, I guess my question, and I can't believe I'm asking it, but after all of this, we're talking about a delta of 9 months to a year. That's the difference.
Again, I mean, Steve won't agree with me here. I think that's the wrong question. I mean, the process, because your assumption is ultimately that all the things that have to go into the availability of equipment, the clearing, et cetera, will occur under two vastly different approaches with two very different risk footprints for the principals who are involved, as though they're going to assume that risk no matter which road you go down. And I just don't think that's true. I know it's not true for us in the vendor community that, you know, we're going to sign radio development agreements and begin putting a lot of R&D and a lot of time into developing radios, not knowing who's ultimately going to end up with the spectrum. You want a little bit more certainty before you do that, because it's not as simple as taking the radios that we're going to be selling in Korea and bringing them here. They're in slightly different bands, there's different tunings, power levels, et cetera. So I think we maybe don't know the answer to this, and I'm guilty of the sin that I have accused others of, which is making an assumption here. But if I am a satellite company and I am asking my shareholders and investors to allow me to take the risk in procuring the technology needed to clear, am I more likely to do that in an environment where I have some ability to influence a process with a return, or one where I'm not sure when or how much I'm going to get paid. We can make promises about you'll be compensated for your clearing costs. I just think it's an oversimplification to look at only the timeline between the two processes and think that what matters, what we think matters, when can you actually begin deploying services, are going to be unaffected by the process. I don't think that's true.
Yeah, Brian's right. I would disagree with him. I think the delta is actually less, and we're not talking about should the satellite companies get compensated, right? I think everybody agrees they should get compensated, and fair compensation that can be established. They'll be motivated, and they should be part of the process, right? If they've got to launch new satellites, if they've got activities that they need to engage in, they should be compensated for that and incentivized to release that spectrum. We're in favor of additional ways to free up that spectrum through fiber, which is very quick and can free it up faster than, again, building and launching satellites. So I think we've got a faster path to clearing than just a pure CBA, particularly if the timeline that they put forward was to clear 180, 200 with the guard band. But if they are really being pushed, and Commissioner O'Reilly said he won't support something that's not in the range of 300 megahertz, there's no path to that. So we don't know what the time frame is on clearing a larger amount of spectrum.
Question.
Hi, Chris Weisark in full disclosure, I went to T-Mobile, but I just wanted a little bit of benefit I have here because I have my computer from me for Brian. For Nokia was a big vendor for T-Mobile, one of the first 600 megahertz suppliers actually. And I'm looking at the dates. The band plan was set on February 28, 2017. The first Nokia base station was type approved on August 1st and deployed in Cheyenne, Wyoming. And more than 1,000 Nokia base stations were deployed by the end of 2017. So it took about 180 days for a public auction for the equipment to go from band plan design to Nokia selling the equipment and deploying it. It seems like you guys have a very good record of public auctions for rapid deployment of spectrum.
So different bands, different issues, different challenges, one of which is we had a lot of heritage and experience working with low band spectrum. So, the engineering involved is a little bit lighter there. And to something that Steve said too, again, my purpose is not to openly disagree with a customer. It's always a wildly unpopular thing to do. But if we want to talk about the incentive auctions, it took the commission 4 years to write rules for that auction after the law passed. And I know that because I helped write the law, which actually created the incentive auction process. So this idea that we can very quickly move through, there's just no experience suggesting that the design of an auction process will be seamless, uncomplicated, and rapid. We have made that assumption. It just honestly isn't supported by history.
There actually is, right? And I think even Patrick's, points to 24 gigahertz auction, right? I mean, an auction process doesn't have to be a complicated design. We can do that quickly. And I find it incredible that, so in low band spectrum, you certainly had lots of experience. This is a band that's being standardized around the world for these services. So my guess is you guys will have equipment pretty quickly.
Last question, but it's confusing that on the one hand, it seems like Nokia is going to be a beneficiary from more time and rules and guard bands on the proposal so that you have more customers that participate in the auction. But on the other hand, you actually want the speed and some of that deference to go to the C-band alliance, which has no incentive really for you to have 2, 3, 4. They don't care. They just want it to be more money. So that's a little confusing that you come down on the side of deferring a little bit more to the C-band alliance.
So first of all, again, and I think we've said this on the record, we see value in moving with a private sale approach because I think we have some disagreements about timing and when things could get done and what the auction pipeline looks like. We've also said we can be completely supportive of a public process, a public auction process. It's really not our place to tell the FCC what you should do. We're trying to inform the debate about what's happening globally in other places and what that may mean for the ecosystem to not have the spectrum available. And candidly, we had hoped that we would have a different process. I would say the longer we wait, at least in our judgment, the more constrained you make your solution set. And so we think making a decision, whatever that decision is going to look like in the next couple of months, we'll support it and we'll move forward with working with it. But if it is going to be a public sale process, I think it has to be made very, very clear that this is such a critical priority band, particularly with no realistic timeline for additional mid-band spectrum to be made available to multiple carriers. This has got to be far more critical than a number of the other things that are already in the pipeline. So process matters less than timing on the decision and moving forward. I mean, I think we just feel we need to bring the curtain down here.
We got a question from Michael. I think this might be the last question.
Yeah, so someone asked Brian primarily, maybe Patrick, in addition, completely separate from whatever the delta is on process delay, there's potential litigation risk delay, which we talked about earlier. So I just want to ask you, since you're saying it's a red herring to be talking about commission authorizing just sort of an open-ended private auction of sale. In other words, you're saying that there will be the sort of guarantees and guardrails that Grant outlined, so that there's transparency, participation, all those things. So how does that, earlier Peter Fish said that his case, in a sense, on whether this is lawful under 309J rested on this fitting into the negotiation exception. So with all those guarantees and guardrails, how do you see the CBA auction being a negotiation? I mean, wouldn't the commission be conceding by laying out all these options? In a sense, all these rules for a fair competition, wouldn't they be conceding that this is a competitive auction and not a negotiation?
Honestly, I hadn't really thought about it in those terms, although going back to your presentation, you mentioned that Congress had legislated on the issue of incentive auctions, and at that time did not, choose to legislate on the issue of private sales as an option. Again, as someone who was intimately involved with that, I can tell you this issue never came up. So I think we have to be very careful before we ascribe congressional intent on this topic. I think it is open to interpretation if the commission wants to effectively create a process that looks and feels a lot like a public auction in the context of a sales process and ensuring people's participation and opportunity to participate. It can do that. Whether it will legally fit into that's just not something that I have really thought about.
Any other thoughts on the legal vulnerability of private auction versus public auction? That'll be our last question. No takers. Nobody? Yeah. There
I guess I'd rather be in court defending the Federal Communications Commission having followed the tried and true path of 309J than gone off in some other direction. There's going to be litigation one way or the other, but that's the way I would answer it.
Actually, I've got one last question. Michael brought this up, that there's a presidential election next year, there's a congressional election next year. Is there really any way this gets so wrapped up that if there's another president that they can't come back and muck it up? Or change direction or otherwise? I mean, are we really going to get far enough along by November of next year that you can't, the next president, whether it's Trump or someone else, isn't going to be able to decide the ultimate outcome?
I mean, I think they can make that we can get far enough along that a good road can be set, and they have the opportunity to do that. And Chairman Pai is certainly focused on this. So I mean, I don't see any reason that we can't get a good road forward now. I mean, I think the discussion earlier was, I mean, if there's an election and somebody comes in until there's an auction and licenses are granted, there's always the potential. But if it's I think if it's a road forward that companies feel comfortable with, that provides incentives to the incumbents to give up spectrum, reallocate spectrum, and move the incumbents out, works for both the satellite companies, for the earth stations. There's enough spectrum for the wireless carriers, and that it's a process that's got integrity. I don't see any reason that a future administration would want to disrupt something like that. I mean, I think everybody sees the benefit of 5G and moving forward with spectrum and broadband services.
All right, well, thank you so much for joining us today, and that concludes the conference. Thanks, everyone.